Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this really beautiful night with the rain outside, perfect for a reading, right? I'm Anna Paulina Lee, and I'm an associate professor here in the Department of Latin American and Iberian Cultures. And it is such a sincere pleasure and honor to be able to introduce our two guests this evening. We have Xiaolu, who is a Chinese-British author and filmmaker. Her novels include, among many, but one of my favorites is A Concise Chinese-English Dictionary for Lovers, really fun and funny and so sincere. And I Am China. Her most recent novel, Radical: A Life of My Own, published by Grove 2023, which is what we'll be mainly focusing on today. And she's the author of so many other novels, and we have the bios on our website too, so you can look at it later. But in addition to being one of the most recognized Chinese British authors today, she also directs films, among which include How Is Your Fish Today, which earned a Sundance official selection. She was an inaugural fellow at the Columbia Institute of Ideas and Imagination in Paris in 2018, and a visiting professor at Columbia University and Baruch College in New York. Xiaolu is also a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. And Jay Gao is a poet from Edinburgh, Scotland. His debut poetry collection, Imperium, is a winner of an Eric Gregory Award and a Somerset Maugham Award. He earned his MFA in Literary Arts Poetry from Brown University, and he's currently living in New York and a PhD student in our very own English and Comparative Literature department, where he studies experimental poetics, form, and race. And so tonight's talk really came together because Xiaolu and I were both fellows at the Institute for Imagination, Ideas and Imagination. And so I also need to thank Mark Mazauer for being the mastermind behind getting us all together. So thank you, and thank you to Eileen Galuli for this invitation as well, and also to Lindsay for organizing Aaron as well. And so today's conversation really came out of this desire to talk about, what does it mean to write as a diasporic author, right? If we're writing in a location, if we're writing to an audience, what does all of that mean when we're kind of in between spaces, we're, not really belonging here or there, but writing for here and there in many ways. And so Jay, I had really the privilege of meeting last year in a graduate seminar, and there's where I also got to read his poetry and wonderful scholarship. And so it just really made sense to bring them together tonight to have this conversation about diasporic lexicons. And so because it's a creative reading and, and Xiaolu also performs, and I had the privilege to perform with her at a poetry festival. It was really fun with music. And so we were thinking of making tonight's talk a bit of kind of a reading performance and having the audience also jump in whenever you want. So we talked about a format before, and well, we want to work with some, the idea of lexicon. So I'm going to start off by asking the authors first to give us some background about the, the inspiration behind their works. And then we're going to do a riff with lexicon. So first, I would like to invite them to talk to us about the inspirations for their work, and then we'll go into our reading. So Xiaolu, yeah.
Inspiration, well, but thank you having me back after 3 years pandemic disaster. Thank you, Eileen and Mark. I began to write this book here when I was co-teaching with Karen. So I said, finally, I could write a sophisticated book, sophisticated narrative book, because I don't work in the academic world. So my life is writing novels, making films, and they often have this guerrilla street style. It's coming from somewhere else rather than academic learning, really from kind of a very raw and a primitive experience. So when I was here, invited by Mark and Carl Gluck, who is not here tonight, but I was so glad, like I was supported finally, safely teaching on the ride. But then the pandemic came, so I had to leave. Disaster. And so this is a strange book. I had to change completely when I got back to London. So for the last 3 years, I just kind of, it's very, very difficult to turn around from a very ambitious, large book to a very personal, private book. And then eventually came about this word radical, which you so wonderfully pick up as, because the original title is called the Lexicon of Separation or Etymology of Separation. And you spot that is a key word, Anna, you used tonight. But really I'm just playing with the concept of radical because the Chinese words, the Chinese characters we call radical, what you call radical, we call 部首. And it's just the most essential fundamental building block of Chinese character, which we call Hanzi, or in Japan called kanji, and you call it radical, so we call it 部首. So every Chinese character is made up from radicals. And actually, I thought it was unique. Well, from a linguistic point of view, it's not at all. In Latin, it's radice. So it's the same root, Latin root, radice. It's like the radish we ate in the salad. So Greek food. So I realized it's going back to exactly the same roots about language. And so the whole book is really about the fundamentals of those simple words, flower, roots, nostalgia. Well, it's not a simple, essential, fundamental word like nostalgia, but man, woman, mother, or gender, or sex, all those very, very simple words. How each page of this book, I try to kind of grow the roots from those basic radice or radical and expand into a supposedly narrative or non-narrative 2 pages. So the book is constructed with 120 words with 100 photos, which is coming around this area, actually around Harlem when I was living here. So that's the original, what do you say, conception of the book. Yeah.
I guess for me, I found myself when I was putting together my first book of poetry, I kept circling back to the same themes, which were sort of mythological, especially Greek myth. And so in the end, I sort of gave in and I was like, okay, this is what the book will be about. The book is called Imperium, which is not a Greek word, but it's a Latin word. But the book is trying to, I guess, translate or recreate some of those impressions from Homer's Odyssey, and the various tensions, some of which is linguistic, some of which is diasporic, that I find haunts me from that text, and thinking through the dissonances within such a sort of canonical work of literature.
Thank you. So as I was reading both of your books, I noticed a number of common themes, but your approach, is incredibly different in a way. There's this kind of sensuality that you both bring to the text, and there's a sense that you're writing about nostalgia and this separation, but yet the way that you approach language is just so tactile. And so thinking about that, I would like to just start off with our key words and have kind of have you do a reading or a response to this idea of nostalgia and how you think about this tactile, this distance, and then how you're using language to think about the space between there and here.
Actually, before I began this project, I didn't need a place like this on the island just to do research. I had this, crazy kind of, it's almost a peasant ambition to rewrite something so far beyond my reach. And so I began with this Dr. Samuel Johnson's dictionary, English dictionary, from hundreds of years ago. And then I thought how to use that dictionary from that old time, Johnson's dictionary, combined with your American Webster's dictionary. And it just based on my words, lexicon from those two Western text, and then somehow sprouting out a private lexicon, which is much to do with private womanhood, to do with immigrants, to do with outsiders, to do with non-Anglophone kind of English words, but the originality is from the outside word. For example, the words like coolie, it's a Chinese word, Chinese slavery, or coffee, which is China. Well, we don't know what's coffee. We call it 中国, but Western, you know what's coffee. And a lot of words from European background, for example, Leben Künstler. It's a German word and meaning living artist, the life as art. And when Leben Künstler as the artist of life without making it as a profession, as a career, without claiming it as an artistic way of living by being a writer, being a painter. And then I think there's quite a lot of Germanic words in this book. So each section starts from a word because I had to use a lot of German words for some reason because the Anglo-Saxon linguistic background, if I write in English, I had to refer to the Germanic word. And then I refer to some French word. For example, you just use nostalgia. And there's one section called, the section titled Nostalgia de la Boue, which is it's nostalgia for the dirt, for the mud. So it's from D.H. Lawrence, Lady Chatterley's lover. And I mentioned today, so when the English gentleman curses his wife having other affairs, he curses her in French. You nostalgia de la Boue. So you have this kind of desire, urge to plug into, yourself into dirty soil. And I thought those incredible, those concepts, and also another word, for example, mash. So these words are in the beginning of the book. I tried to launch the book into discussion, very much unlike Dr. Johnson. But I think, I didn't tell Eileen or Mark what I was doing. And I think the pandemic completely changed. I went back to London. I just thought it's not possible to continue that kind of silly, idiotic ambition to reinvent a lexicon from a private position, So then the book became really the book of separation. And it's really about just this kind of painful linguistic separation from my Chinese background, as also which established myself in China, but kind of completely lost because of political issues. Then I came to the West. I came to Britain, actually. So I became British by legally I had to give up Chinese citizenship. And it just, when the Brexit happened, then I thought about, I will become European if I could, by getting a new identity from losing my original identity. But instead I came to New York. And I think the book is about, it just is still, in my middle age, I desperate to try to belong to something larger than this small me, by collecting all these very traditional, essential words. And in Dr. Johnson's dictionary, I remember I was looking at X, and there's X, and Samuel Johnson said, well, X doesn't exist in any Anglophone word. And I thought that's amazing. And he said the X only came from Spanish or Latin. And I think the original text, when I wrote here in New York before the pandemic, the book began with X. I know how you refer to, say, this book is addressing to the dead Dr. Johnson, which, all our words, kind of, half of words he collected. But X doesn't exist in Anglophone world. Okay, my name starts from X, but it's nothing to do with my Chinese writing, which is much more complicated than Hanzi or Kanji writing. But the Romanization starts from X. Who am I? I'm Romanized. I'm ghettoized in another major language, coming from a major language to another major language. So that's the strange, the move of the book. Now it's no longer a dictionary, and lucky you can read some article now. So,
yeah. I guess for me, this question of nostalgia is so interesting because, to take it apart, nostos is such a main theme of the Odyssey, right? This idea of homecoming. And, to go back to why I wrote this book or felt compelled to write this book, I feel that when I grew up as a child, I was sort of completely saturated in mythological stories. It was the type of stories I like to read the most rather, and, from all sorts of cultures. And it wasn't until, going back to those texts as an adult in the sort of unabridged versions. When I was younger, I would read like illustrated versions of them, right? Or condensed stories for kids. that I felt so nostalgic for these characters and this language. And I felt that where was that nostalgia coming from? The sense of, I guess, borrowing the language of a text that I felt was mine, but also not at the same time. And sort of what to do with that sense of nostalgia, that sort of the pain of reading these texts and finding myself drawn to not just necessarily the main character, but also the minor characters, which actually interested me more in the Odyssey. So, you know, and you can argue that Penelope is not a minor character, but, you know, maybe like Penelope or Elpenor or Odysseus's maid, you know, these characters for me, I felt so much more affinity with. I have a poem actually called Nostalgia, which I would like to read out.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So this poem, I guess, is about Elpenor in a way. I have a couple of poems about Elpenor, who is a minor character, who quite idiotically dies on an island because I think he wakes up too late, sees the ship moving in the horizon, and he trips off the roof and he dies. And everyone forgets about him. Odysseus forgets about him until they're already sailing. And then they're like, oh, where's Elpenor? Who is also one of the youngest men on the crew. And they meet him later in the underworld. So this is called Nostalgia. Although advised that ghost stories were an acceptable topic of conversation, I was still surprised to discover small talk sucks up all the time in the afterlife. After my death, my first true appraisal is to be forced to host a nation-warming party. I have to invite all those bullying Argonauts from my childhood who now arrive matured with a full gamut of their remorse. First, I ushered them into the living room, then left to fetch a platter of finger foods, the egg from the last ever bird on the planet, I, a few hours earlier, hastily pureed into a delicious aioli without guilt. Upon my return, I found those lads at rest, collected fondly together like a pile of pink petals trembling from an old gifted lotus root. Left to me with zero instructions of care. What am I to do with you? I asked myself, staring down at the shed skin of my ripened guests. I pushed their legion presents to one side. Every bottle of wine sloshed as if it contained a set of gears, a trapped clock waiting to be let out, to turn into a ship. Later, when the lads are partying on the roof, when I am tasked to clean up their inevitable carnage, their broken bottlenecks, their crisp packets, their loosened morals, I forget the most vital host role, that the living are obliged to prepare a banquet for the past. Even after all my mortal practice, time preparing for the life that comes after, I was never taught how to invite the dead back onto the table, how to break bread with ghosts, zero guidebook instructions for signaling a civil time for my strangers to exit tonight.
Wonderful. And so the next word I wanted to riff on is we're talking about Chineseness, right? And diaspora. And so what does that actually mean when you're writing and when you're thinking about your audience? You know, how do you actually situate a space? I mean, this is part of the kind of the core of what you're doing, A Life of My Own. Where do you write from, and who are you writing to when you're thinking about this idea of, you know, Chineseness? So audience.
I think here, I think everyone understands if I say it's really this essay by Deleuze the major language, the minor language about Kafka. I think I referred to that essay. I don't know if, in Waterstone people will pick up, to read until that page, which is 235 pages. But it's really the key thing of the loose text, how to be, ask myself how to be a gypsy in the major language. So how to be a gypsy in Chinese language when I was writing Chinese, and that's a huge major language. Yet I never felt I belonged to that language because I came from Southern China. I was born post-Cultural Revolution, which means I write in slogan-like China Memoir, little red book-like kind of language, which is nothing to do with the ancient, this beautiful, meandering, poetic Asian Chinese language, which I should have belonged, but I didn't because I was a Red Guard generation, which only do the slogan language. So I was a traveler in my own major language. And I think when I read Deleuze, I really studied when I'm co-teaching with Karen, confronting the students here, I had to really, really look at the text. I said, my God, the French knew very well, even though they don't really use any other language other than French language, because, for French authors, why would you use other inferior language, And I think they never really lived rest of their life, invest their second life in another culture at that time in 1960s. And it's different after 1980s, like we all just self-abandoned into another culture and adopt a second language like I was doing in the last 20 years writing in broken English. So I felt very much a gypsy in now a major language in English. And I say, this is very kind of strange ghetto hold I'm doing. I try to get out a censored Chinese linguistic writers ghetto hold, and I plunge into another ghetto hold, which I don't belong to a, major Anglophone writers club, which I found it really also disturbing. I think 20 years living in Britain, I think I struggled to find my identity in English language. And I say, I'm going to write this radical to get out from that kind of ghetto hold, which ghetto I belong to, because how come I always in that one ghetto or the other, So the old question is really, I'm worried about this word diaspora, because it seems to be a depressed word. I think the language, I would like to perhaps just read a little section to answer you more nuancedly. Otherwise, I prepared one section actually dedicated to Carol, didn't come tonight because she had a little accident. That's to do with marriage. But this probably to do with language. I don't know why I prepared, yeah. So I might do this, this one before I answer you, Anna, first. I do this little dedication to Carol. She didn't come tonight. Because I mean, the reason I was here 3-4 years ago, because Carol and Mark got me here, dragged me out from Brexit Britain. So I was able to be here for a year, well, then killed again by pandemic. I mean, this is the first, I think, grown-up book I ever written after writing 20 novels in my life, because I could never write a non-adolescent book for some reason. So whenever I look at Mark's book or Karen's book, I thought, God, they can write grown-up books, because I somehow, this is perpetual silly youth in Boris Vian's La Cume de Jus, never grow up. And then, so this book was written really just in this anxiety of being a woman, being a mother, being a partner, away from first country, away from second country, struggle to find my freedom as this flaneurs walking around in a third country, which is America. So a section called Wedlock, I will come back to that. Wedlock. So again, very laboriously, is that the word? I had to define that word, wedlock, and with a Chinese translation sort type underneath. And then I make 2 pages of pseudo-narrative, but which is very painful from my own diary, just to somehow marry this intellectual lexicon idea with a certain narrative, which my positions, I'm not in the academic world, so I do narrative books. And each time I struggle, go back to my diary. So wedlock, this is a quote attributed to French author Alexandre Dumas. He said, the chain of wedlock is so heavy that it takes two to carry it, sometimes three to carry that chain. I thought of the child Jane and I have been bringing up in Britain. Yes, a child is more important than a marriage, perhaps. Marriage would mean little to me, even if I were to carry that chain. But a child, yes, is a strong chain, almost unbreakable. The chain is not a positive metaphor. And for women, a child can be a home. And this is especially so if you are an immigrant. And for the immigrant, that answers your question. The child is a new root. The child grows in the soil where you find yourself. And the child ties you to that place, even if you are from somewhere else. But what if a woman needs another kind of home or wants to send out her own new roots? It is so much more difficult for her to acquire a certain freedom than a man. And when money is not sufficient and the social support is scarce, how do we survive in this struggle between being being a mother and being free to pursue creativity? A moral judgment condemns a woman who separates herself from her child. And even if, for a short while, a man can leave, a man can sail around the world and he won't be judged. A man's identity is not defined in relation to a child or a woman, but to the world. If childbearing and marriage define a certain woman's identity, then she's lucky. But this isn't how I identify myself, especially and not here, not in America, where I had no history. Nor did anyone know my history. America gives me this sense of potential, that potential we all have, but seldom activate. And for some reason, I thought of Lo Andreas Salome's life. Salome's relationship with Nietzsche was conditioned by her time, with its concepts of marriage as a religious sacrament and an economic arrangement. If not for all that, would Nietzsche and Salome have ended up as lovers? Who knows? Maybe she did not love Nietzsche at all. For him, her rejection was a deep wound, which sent him up into the mountain and to his beloved Ubermensch. In contrast, Salome moved on, and later she married a professor of linguistics and lived in a secure but celibate marriage. She then met the young poet Rilke and discovered sexual love at the age of 37. Freud was fascinated by her. She corresponded with Freud and built her psychoanalyst career. She created her own freedom. She overcame what she had been. But I was not a Salome. I was more like a patient in her clinic. I was a case study for her practice and her explorations of mental conflict. And in this case, time had reversed. My analyst was in the past, and I was here, a woman living through a moment in the 21st century. So that is actually I think it's located somewhere in the early part of the book after the lexicon, after the radical nu, woman, and motherhood. So then I had to bring out this word, wedlock. For me, just so urgent to put that word forward.
I guess this question of Chineseness is for me also quite interesting because, you know, on one level, this book is not about Chineseness. But then it has to be because I'm Chinese and I wrote the book, right? So it actually is about it. But I'm very aware that, you know, at least in the UK, there's not been a long history of Chinese writers, especially Chinese poets, right? It's quite recent. And that I didn't want to necessarily be pigeonholed or, you know, to be sort of, to be put into a ghetto that, okay, you have to write about, you know, Chinese food, or like, you have to write about your stern parents, or, like stereotypes, which, we in the US now here think are quite silly, but actually it's so interesting in the UK that they permeate through the sort of publishing machines in various guises. I remember there's a really amazing poet from Hong Kong called Sarah Howe, who in the UK, and the Guardian review of her book was basically like, oh, this book is not Chinese enough, and then it said, but she looks really good, she looks very mysterious and enigmatic. That is not uncommon in the UK, hopefully less so nowadays. But the question of like, even that word Chineseness is so interesting because, I know in Chinese studies, diasporic studies, there's been this sort of debate about whether it should be called Sino-diaspora, right, or Sino studies, to get rid of, the Chinese aspect. And it's a good question of, what links myself as someone who's ethnically Chinese but was born in the UK to someone who is Chinese but lives in Singapore, to someone who's Chinese but lives in Mauritius, to someone who's Chinese but lives in Brazil. What actually links us together, and why is that so important? I guess because otherwise we would be out of jobs, if there was no one to think about these linkages. But I'm curious about what risks and what sort of implications that has, that sort of like that word diaspora.
Yeah. Exactly. I think the struggle, to go beyond your linguistic identity is really a writer's struggle, immigrant writer's struggle. I mean, this is not very lightly said because I found myself really just struggle with that. Often, I am not interested in which nationality I would have, unless going through the customs in the airport. But people mistaken your national identity as your sense of identity. And of course, I always play hippie, like, oh, I have no identity. I'm an animal, I'm a chicken, I'm a fish, so let's get out this another ghetto of identity politics, which I'm so allergic about. But I think my sense is this, can we go beyond our linguistic identity when we talk about expression? Can we stop using that as a weapon to defend our art or our expression or our pseudo identity, which I don't believe in. But then we can't, because the language is a device which you use, and it's also a great weapon to somehow to suggest if you don't own my language, you don't own the knowledge which out there. You cannot possess that language. So I do indeed, I'm double standard. I'm using those languages in my book, especially the Chinese part in my book. So it doesn't demand you to be a sinologist to read this narrative book, or novel, but it does kind of challenge you or offend you sometimes. On your face, say, "Hey, well, great, Greek, but this word, what? We should also know, 10 times of those words too, So I think really just I try to make a sort of assault on language, in the sense, I want to call the radical. So how language becomes a narrative focal of a book, which includes Eastern Western language. And I also remember I was here, I tried to find some reference, and I looked around Steven Pinker, and I thought, oh God, the language instinct by Steven Pinker might suggest some kind of truth. I found nothing, sorry. And because the Eastern reference was so rare, and also I come from, and also in Noam Chomsky, I love the idea of language precedes all the identities, language as a universal structure. You are born with language, you are not adopting any language, because the language, as Heidegger said, possesses us before we were even born. You don't live under that language identity. The language possessed you before you were you. So I do believe that kind of, it's almost Noam Chomsky's language as universal structure. We cannot escape from it, and we're just pathetically adopting one or two or three. So I might just read this section about language in the later part of my book, because indeed, language is a narrative focal in this book, which is why my books never sell. my publisher's really worried. Like, what's your next book? Forget about this one. Go on next one. And I did finish my next two books, but I don't think they can sell either. So this is called language is virus, and then there's kind of long definition of what that means. Language is virus, 语言病毒, that's in Chinese. In his supposed sci-fi novel, The Ticket That Exploded, William S. Burroughs writes, language is a virus from outer space. Burroughs gives us a dark vision of language. Words have plagued our minds and now they control us. But we don't recognize this. To quote William Burroughs, the word has not been recognized as a virus because it has achieved a state of stable symbiosis with the host. So as he thinks, when the language virus has permeated every aspect of our lives, it is stable, yet it mutates. We die, but the virus lives on, spreading far and wide. But I find it strange that William Burroughs, the language virus is from outer space rather than an integral element of our human life. And the very idea of language infecting us makes no sense if, as Lacan suggested, we are always and we are already language. But for William Burroughs, there was a paradise in which Adam and Eve lived without language, and their minds is in pure and direct contact with each other and the world. Then came language in the form of a serpent, and it infected them. Therefore, paradise lost. So here is some primitive talk. I have different vision of language. For me, language is everything. It is my means of escape from the story that was already written before my arrival in this world. It is my path to freedom. When, as a child, I first became aware of my surroundings, and I found myself living in a fishing village with my illiterate grandparents. My grandfather did not speak much, nor did my grandmother. Both of them couldn't write their own names. But their physical language, his violence towards her, and her daily prayers before a Buddha statue, told me that I should not live in their world and no speak in their tongue. So I left. So I went to live with my parents. And later, when I lived with my parents, I discovered my father had another language, painting. The way he expressed his vision of the world through images revealed to me that the possibility of different kind of language when that takes the form of art. And my father showed me that it is possible to choose how to live one's life. After I left my parents, I wrote books and made films. I experimented with new languages. I tried to live the life he showed me was possible, a life based in creation and imagination. To live vividly is to have languages, not only language in the limited linguistic sense, but language as an artistic tool, language as art, language as a way to live an authentic life.
Theme of language, and you talk a lot about etymology, but I think what runs across both of your work is a sort of push towards an anti-etymology in a way. You start with a word, you're
Yeah, I mean, the language question is so interesting because actually Chinese is quite alien to me in some ways. I'm not fluent in Chinese, which is a sort of classic diasporic problem. And it's an issue that's caused great shame, great sort of miscommunication between myself and I guess my family. But I second what Xiaolu said earlier about this idea of having to find one's own language. And when I was writing this book, I was really sort of in the back of my mind thinking about something this French linguist, Emile Benveniste, said, where he says, well before it communicates, language is used for living. So even though I, cannot communicate so well in Chinese, I'm still using it in sort of strange and deformed and alien ways, I guess. I might read out I have some poems in here which play on this idea of the relationship between hospitality, right? And hostel and host and hospitable and hostel, as in a place you live or you go to on holiday. And I've been interested in those linguistic relationships and how they circulate around each other. So I might just read a poem called Hostel, which is spelled Hostel. I have another poem called Hostile as well. Hostel. Camouflaged in the hostel's fire alarm, I retreated to my skeleton bunk. As I sank into its exposed foam, my worldly exhaustion, squeezing out lifeless black ants from every sweat pore, like an interrupted army on a skin of clay. So I looked around me, witnessing those archetypes from the dorm's alien occupants, littered on their sheets like loosened halos, and as if I were being crowded out by invisible ghosts. I heard the buzz of bass playing from one headphone bud left above me. And as the drunk gap year students danced on the hostel roof, I found it unnerving to catalogue all their trinkets of metamorphosis, a map, a dictionary, a jock strap, a silk scarf, a ticket stub, their designer luggage bursting open like imported organs all over the linoleum. So near to me, vast layers of red fabric scattered like the softest ore, traveling ceremonials out of reach on their beds. I think I had disturbed the room with my mortal presence there. The navy sheet of a stained bedding twitched over my knees like a borrowed skin. I knew that as I sat in their beds, I risked soon being walked upon, that right away I would be unmasked as an invader and become as unwanted as a species infamous for its parasitism.
It's difficult topic, alien, because it invites, but also rejects. I think it made me think about the alienness of language. So as I was writing this book, I did some reading about language and unconscious. And then I was just, I think, saw a few paragraphs in this Freud's introduction to dream language or introduction to psychoanalysis. And then he mentioned the dream language and our subconscious has this immense similarity towards Chinese written language. And I think I quoted somewhere in this book, but now I can't find it because it was long, this is long ago. And it says, when he discovered the Chinese language is so ancient, one of the most Asian languages still being used and not dated at all. And then it's the biggest language people still use in the writing. He was mortified by its vagueness of the written Chinese language, because also, you know, if you know a little bit Chinese, there's no verb conjugation, no plural or singularity, or no gender. You know, it's very difficult. You know, you look at the verb, you never know where this event happened or will happen or had been happening. You know, there's no indication. And its immense vagueness and its Victorian nature of Chinese language, I think Freud suggests that must be the explanation of the dream language about our unconscious. And then later on, I think I read something also about that from Lacan, to do with, you know, he using the Chinese language as a kind of example to look at the dream, people's dream, you know, how the dream language is being composed, the similarity of Chinese language. I mean, all this is very far-fetched to talk about the alienness of, to understand another kind of language, which is unconscious, which is not verbal language, not a written language, not literal language. And I do, because as a writer of both, you know, two languages, every single session, I think, not here, but in a normal, you know, say Waterstone bookshop, you know, the very first question, very often the same question is, do you write in or think in one language or do you dream in another language? You know, something like that, or what's a translation process? You know, given that I wrote many books in Chinese before I began writing English books, and I never know how to answer that, because I was closed by some Swiss psychoanalyst in Switzerland. They said, no, you do not dream with verbal language. You dream with the psycho languages. so I was like, yeah, you are great. You are right. Because I tried to understand, you know, so some psychoanalysts told me the dream language would take about 7 years or 17 years to use a local language to dream. And so that's arbitrary, 7 or 17 years. So I can dream in American English rather than in British English, or you know, because there's a statistics, right? So some people said, well, after about 17 years in Switzerland, I began to dream in Swiss German rather than German, High German. And then I thought, my God, so what about a Chinese dream in American English? That would take 27 years. And then those psychoanalysts verified with me, it's not about verbal language. The dream is visual psychic language. It's not verbalized. Once you narrate it in a human language, it becomes a verbal language, which becomes linguistic, you know, a linguistic issue. So then, my God, that's my answer to your question about alien. I have no idea that this alienness. And also kind of constructing this book, which is disaster, you know, I think it's so wonderful you write poems, because it doesn't require a very urgent kind of ending, you know. And also I'm published by Penguin Random House. I have this kind of invisible pressure to make a supposed kind of narrative ending, which is always very painful. You know, there's no ending apart from one ending for human. But I just collect a lot of words to do with future. So, you know, in the end of the book, I remember something to the alien, to do with algorithm, to do with ecofeminism, to do with something to do with biology. And those words somehow suggest a kind of direction, you know, where the language is going to go, you know, the verbal language. You know, whether the verbal language continue or whether the verbal language would be replaced by another kind of language, a coded language, you know. And actually, some of them already been deleted, took down, you know, before the publication, because it's very obscure. And that's not my real, you know, authentic knowledge. You know, it's really from the research. And I think I had trouble to lead this book to a future about language. You know, it's after all, it's very primitive, you know, empirical, physical experience, you know, in this book, rather than a more research, scientifically based book. So I found it impossible to look towards the future or alien in terms of the discussion of language.
So going off of what you just mentioned with the visual psychic language and how it really is about kind of this transformation and of the architecture of your dreams in a way, right? So there's this really physical, in a way, visually, in your dreams. So it's not just language, but the structure of how you're thinking, seeing in the subconscious is changing. And so we're thinking about that in the sense of, the architecture, the things. And both of you also do this, which is, you both use plants and things to tell the movement of histories too. So I would maybe talk about how, the plants also tell a story, or how you're using, the life jacket in the plane to suddenly that is, the protagonist, and how do you think about these life forms in these inorganic or organic matter?
It's so funny because some of my friends know right now I'm working on a manuscript, a second poetry collection about trees and medieval trees, and how trees and medieval texts around the world have been sort of globally represented. And they become these really strange things, right? These alien objects which allow for transformation, sublimation. They are places where violence happens, but also places where the realm between life and death sort of disappears. And so all this talk about alien, the words that we use, alien, invasive, migrant species for that we ascribe to plants. I'm really interested in how that connection connects to the words we use for marginalized communities. And there are trees in this book, as there are many wonderful trees and plants in the Odyssey. The last poem in this book is sort of about Penelope and Odysseus's bed, which is made from a living oak tree. But I might just read a poem called Agent Orange, which is about, I guess, plant life in a way. And then, there's an epigraph I really love that I use from Czesław Miłosz, where he writes, "Not that I want to be a god or a hero, just to change into a tree, grow for ages, not hurt anyone." Agent Orange. 2 mandarins she wrapped in pink tissue for the temple shrine have not decayed one bit in half a year since she last left them kneeling on their imitation gold saucer. She wished for them to mutate into twins, one ordinary girl, one ordinary boy, one waxy orb, a little larger, leaning on its sibling, green rind scented with a firmness to persist forever, smooth chemicals circulating in their peels, altering the curling of smoke from her joss stick, raised up like a laurel branch. So she directs the same prayer to her eldest son, who, an ocean away, would now be the same age Arthur Galston was when, as a green graduate student in Illinois, he used acid to coax flower buds and fruit out of baby soybeans so they would mature faster than nature willed it, before he later studied how peas might squirm or shrug indifferently to various angles of light brought close then far. He dreamt the research in his 20s could heal a hungry world, but the more he fed his specimens, the more his crops undressed themselves, blooming into their lack, losing color, losing structure, until every leaf fell from every body, and every leaf dissolved into nothing, and every body became a fine spray from a helicopter one might mistake for the morning mist on the mangroves. In that unseen contract between plant cell, and foreign agent. Arthur studied many life cycles sped up to their unnatural limits, unable to foresee how fast the future might travel in all directions with its relentless momentum whenever an endpoint is forced too early. At the shrine, she hears a jingle, and for one instant, everything is paused, sacred and slow. She considers taking down her ancestral fairy lights, but the LED bulbs still command respect as they pulse through rainbow spectrums on time-delayed currents, on, then off, then on again, communicating to each other covertly like ungerminated seeds, like a corpse blinking one eye open, then the other, like a code flashed from a shard of armor in the heart of a cave, in front of the plastic Buddha replica. Two electric candles flicker with a wildness like Kojian grass, demanding new batteries. She hovers her hand between them like the false memory of a rain cloud, and perhaps she senses the latency of heat, recollect before refracting, suspend before strengthening, past the variegations of her skin, the same way a colorless liquid might become more saturated, not less, as it moves from one body to another body. You know, wait, stop, sorry. It's like when Celan writes, the image spawns a child with it, half image and half veil. Like when a veil coddles the surface tension of a sea before ripping it apart. The split chest of a wooden ship that used to be a child. And I guess I just want to say, you know, why go to Celan in that narrative moment? You know, and I think because I felt there was this inadequacy of getting close to this cathartic, coherent narrative of violence and military imperialism. You know, Benjamin talks about all texts as being documents of barbarism. And so I wanted to write something, I was writing something, and then felt that actually as a mode of failure, there was no way I could end this poem in the way that I wanted. And so I had to do that, you know, performative. And some readings of that poem, I do different things with that sort of switch. Yeah. Thank you.
So we have some time to open it up to the audience. If you want to, say a word, your keyword, or ask a question, and we can have the authors read back or answer however they find appropriate. So yes, right here in the front.
Thank you both. I was wondering about whether the idea of a contemporary writer or a contemporary user of language is something that you think about when you work, especially in the context of being aware that language having a history that is often arbitrary, or having a convention that is contingent. And I think of this, especially in the context of Chinese language, because I think so much of our language is made up or recently invented in the past 100 years or so. And because we're still so close to that moment of invention, I feel like it's like it feels like the language is unstable in a sense. I wonder if, but also in the context of English as well. I was just wondering if you could speak on that.
It's difficult to, it's a great question. I'd be nihilistic because it's such an immense PhD question. I found it speechless because we're living within the complexity and the very kind of language can be so abusive. I think it doesn't matter if it's Chinese or English or French or German. I was reading this essay long ago. I think Salman Rushdie wrote in the 70s, and he said he really hated that word, Commonwealth. And he said, I am not Commonwealth writer, even though I might come from subcontinent. What is Commonwealth? I reject to use that word. It's not to do with language at all. It's to do with the political identity, right? So it doesn't matter if I speak English or French or Chinese here. I think the struggle is to challenge a certain kind of political, this jacket you were wearing supposed to be handed as your identity. And I refuse that, wearing that one jacket. And I think I exactly understand why he says, Sam Rushdie said, I'm not going to any Commonwealth Writers Conference. I am Anglophone writer. I might not be an English writer, but I am proud Anglophone writer. English language is the one I use from beginning to the end. And I thought about, really is this exiled in, you can exile in one language, even you don't know other languages. So what I mean is just I think just for me, I think I did, find a kind of identity crisis. I think when I left China, came to Britain using broken English to write, I have no reference, just this street writer tried to adopt a kind of street English to write. And I think the difficulty is just how to be powerful with that set of poverty of the language I had, which is very limited. But just to challenge the ready-made meaning of that, of one language, to challenge that with some odd, smuggled in concept, yet use the same language. So I think I didn't answer very clearly, but I think you get a sense what I try to say. Yeah.
I think for me, it helps being a poet because, all I think about is language, and I don't have to have that pressure of coming up with like a narrative per se. But poetry is language. It's the space where people are playing about and experimenting with it, which is what I love so much about poetry. And when I return to Asian diasporic writers, poets who, have for a long time been playing with language, been playing with, Chinese and English and the sort of relationships therein. I mean, these aren't poets, but she's not a poet, but, someone like, nor is she Chinese, but Yoko Tawada, who is, I think, exophonic, right? Who writes in German and Japanese. Her books are all about language and that sort of wonderful mix when those two cultures, nationalities, languages come together. And so I think a lot of like really interesting work is being done. Increasingly, as we become more cognizant of diasporic communities, of this idea of comparative diasporas.
Do we have any other comments or questions?
Virginia Woolf once had a correspondence with a Chinese woman writer, Ling Shuhua. And when Ling Shuhua was writing in English, after writing in Chinese also most of her life, living in Beijing and Wuhan and Sichuan, she said to her that the Chinese language was rich and that she should maintain the rhythms of the Chinese as well as the different kinds of parables and proverbs that are inherent in a lot of Chinese language and writing. And she said to keep the charm of the unfamiliar in writing in English. So I wonder if there isn't some value in what she said in preserving aspects of Chinese in English that makes it into an unusual and unique style.
Sure, I think perhaps not only preserving, but propagate it. Dare I say, I mean, in a way, I wish I could be a language colonist, propagate, completely prevail, but how can? I mean, it's one-way street, we're all speaking English here. And if you can, you speak French. So it's not a two-way street. I mean, what I can do is to introduce those moved concepts. For example, in the book, when I mentioned those section, for example, called the Cathay, which is to do with the misunderstood the name of China. We don't know what is Cathay, but you know what's Cathay. I have never heard of Cathay until the first time 10 years ago I took the Cathay Pacific airline. Then I said, what is Cathay? Of course, Cathay, I know what is 中国. And also other words like Kulu, for example, there's many words which is this very loud Anglophone words, and then you find actually is purely Chinese words, and the history is this 13th century, 14th century Portuguese, Italian, Jesuit Christians came to China and Japan, and they are very good-willed. They were good-willed translating all the Asian text back into European language. And those texts were so moved, in this kind of double translation, in the middle of time, now how the Jesuit missionary translate the Chinese concept back. For example, I Ching, translated I Ching back to European language, which is, remotely nothing to do with anything, right? So what I'm saying, it's so difficult to be truly polymath, and we just have so much time. What I'm trying to say is a lot of writers like me, I think, try to make sort of hybridity, conceptually very sexy. I mean, I was teaching with Karen, we teach hybrid literature, right? What is hybrid literature? I mean, for a novelist, for an artist, you can't really hybrid in the very literary sense. You have to really digest what that means in English language, and how can I steal that concept, translate back into your first language, and then somehow building a bridge, bring you back, transport, whatever, or immigrant you back or transport you back into this second language. It's a very, very complex process. It's why are you doing that? Because we don't have political power, so we have to use the literature to influence you, a major language Western reader to understand what, 中国 means, or what 树跟花, those words mean, which is very far away from the English language, but yet as if we're speaking the same concept because we hybrid the concept together. So I struggle, and the major struggle is not the language at all. I think my struggle is to somehow make the narrative has more has this intellectual rigor with human aspects. So the reading is this very deep, deceptive process. You are as if reading a story, but really, mined by some intellectual weapons there, try to either bomb you or collecting you along the way. So I mean, with novel form, maybe it's more obvious. I think with this book, I think I do try to do that, vaguely, intellectually. Yeah.
We have time for one more comment. Okay.
It was just following up on this question of moving between languages and what you just said, Xiaolu, and what you mentioned when you said exophonic. And I'm just wondering if what you said about it being a kind of a failure of being able to be a critical book, this book called Radical, you said you were going to write this kind of dissertation about what this all was about. And so then we listened to all the different words and we heard that you were definitely a novelist, but I don't see quite as much the difference that you guys are making between being a novelist and a poet in terms of your particular works. But then at the very end, when you just responded to this question, Xiaolu, you said that it is a political work, that it is an intellectual project, sort of coming up. And so my question for you is just at the end of this, and I don't know your work as well, then I will read it and I would love to, but I just had a question for Xiaolu about what it means to write this story that you have been writing about moving between two languages and trying to make language activate and do things, right? And what it means, what's different about this book, because I hear it's different because of the fact that it's actually commenting on, it's more meta, but I just want to know how. I'm just sort of curious.
I was going to read a section about called molting. It's about crab. When crab become adult crab, so they had to shed the skin, and then if it's a female crab, molting, and then right after the skin off, the female crab would have this mating time right after that process. And I think I find that I find it useful to use that in the early part of the book, because the book is really, it's 200 words, basically. I had to shuffle like crazy for 2 years. I shuffle back and forth. I may as well, open the museum, put those words in the large print, so then it's kind of more visibly, kind of louder. But I think, I don't know, I think I'm very politically engaged person, and that get me very angry with a lot of things. But one thing is, you ask, what is new? I think it's the old thing is I do not want to live in this huge narrative, linguistically and politically. So I think, I confess, I feel very allergic reading family sagas, this huge narrative of this immigration journey. I have my huge respect to those authors, but I'm allergic from the page one, and it's really like this. Doris Lessing said in her Golden Notebook, I think she said something like, why Golden Notebook? Her novel is about 6 different books: Black Book, Golden Book, Red Book, White Book. So each book will record a different and a war for a different Doris Lessing, who is a woman, who is a communist, who is this, who is lover, who is whatever, right? So is this narrative these days, as an author, I see the whole industry is about fragmented, individual, egocentric, personal story, and that is the God. And I think I'm slightly allergic to that individual is a God. That's the narrative we have. My gender, my issue, my identity is the narrative, and I'm like, no, no, you are nothing but just human narratives. And so I thought, how could I cook a book, collecting all this fragmented life and individual experience into one by using different language, using different reference from European classical work and the Chinese and Asian and, whatever Japanese reference in the end of the book. So therefore, I can get away from this me is the narrative, this me culture, which I'm very much kind of neurotic about it. So what is new? Nothing is new. It's just return to the roots, return to the dirt. Nostalgia de la boue, enter your fingers, get your finger dirty, look at the originality of our human narrative, which is, one section, I remember, anyway, just in one of the talk, I didn't read anything. I just read one line from the book. And it's a line from Puccini's opera called Turandot. And this, bizarrely, Puccini wrote an opera with, 3 Chinese Taoists, and the Turandot was Chinese princess. Bizarre. And then there's one line from this Taoist telling the prince, who was madly in love with Turandot. And the Taoist said, there's no Turandot. There's only Tao there. So everything's in your head. So I think that's the only line I read in one representation of my book. And I thought, that is it. There's no narrative there. There's no Turandot. There's no beautiful princess. It's only Tao there. And what is Tao? Tao is away. Okay, we're going to check out with our own life and death. So it's very kind of militant. It's bizarrely childish. I guess just reaction to this incredible, this me self-narration of this super narrative of this one, right? So I don't want that. So, but paradoxically, it's the same thing in the end, probably.
just to say very quickly that, you know, I agree completely with what you said, that so much of the politics of writing is actually like the insistence of oneself, you know, through again and again with each work, because you're always at the risk of being misread or mistranslated. And, you know, I just always think back to, and I'm sure you have many experiences in the UK of going to readings, and you just know when a certain person has come to ask you a question that has nothing to do with your book, but, you know, they've, nothing you could say in that reading would change that question or alter the mission they had, because they see you first as this sort of like Chinese, right? And then they see you as this slate to project their own sort of fascinations with. And, you know, that happens again and again. And because that does so, you know, it means that everything I write has to risk, you know, it has to constantly keep insisting on my own self, my identity, you know, whether I want to it or not.
Well, I think we're out of time. I'm sorry, but we'll stick around in case you want to come and buy a book and get it signed. So please help me thank our guests today for wonderful event.